G'day YouTube. So welcome to the second video in my series on Plato. So I've had a request by Indy to do a video on embodied cognition as well as a request to do imaginary numbers because I do intend this to be a mathematics channel as well as a philosophy channel. So imaginary numbers will come soon, and embodied cognition is something that I may talk about when I do a video series on philosophy of mind. I do plan, however, to do other topics before philosophy of mind, such as metaphysics, epistemology, critical reasoning, formal logic, philosophy of language, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of science, as well as a video series dedicated to individual philosophers like this one, and of course many topics in mathematics. So stay tuned, Indy, I won't forget. But it's also worth noting that embodied cognition is a research area in cognitive and social psychology, so philosophy by no means has a monopoly on the idea, but the idea does originate from philosophy of mind. Many ideas in psychology arrive in psychology from philosophy. Indeed, the old name for psychology is philosophy of mind before it grew up, matured, moved out, and got a job. In fact, the old name for science is natural philosophy, even as recently as Sir Isaac Newton, who is perhaps history's most brilliant physicist, was called a natural philosopher in his time. His famous book, often called the Principia for short, or Principia Mathematica, is Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, which is Latin for mathematical principles of natural philosophy. And like I said in the previous video, I'm not a scholar of classical languages, so my Latin pronunciation is probably incorrect. But that's where he introduces his laws of motion and theories of gravity, etc. Okay, so that book is not to be confused with Principia Mathematica, written by Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, which are two philosophers and mathematicians writing about the foundations of mathematics and trying to reduce all of mathematics down to first-order logic. Okay, so in one sense, philosophy is a bit of a science factory, according to history, at least. Strands of thought break away from philosophy when thinkers agree on common methods for answering certain questions, and sciences are born. But it hasn't always happened like this. Sometimes a science distinguishes itself within another science. So, for example, chemistry inside physics. Anyways, moving on. Last video we ended with an example of the Socratic method, and I just thought I'd include a passage here from some of the conversation in the Republic between Socrates and Polemarchus. Okay, so here's an excerpt from the Republic. Socrates says, and I'm cutting these quotes short. Socrates says, "And what is that which justice gives, and to whom?" And Polemarchus replies, yada yada yada. Justice is the art which gives good to friends and evil to enemies. And then Socrates goes on, and in what sort of actions or with a view to what result is the man most able to do harm to his enemy and good to his friend? And Polemarchus replies, in going to war against the one and in making alliances with the other. And then Socrates delivers the punchline. He says, "Then in times of peace, justice will be of no use." It's a statement which is a question. It's a question framed as a statement. So anyways, moving on. We talked a little bit about the early dialogues last video, so we'll talk about the middle dialogues now. And in the middle dialogues, the concern switches, really, to philosophical underpinnings of this notion of form, which I mentioned last time. And this is possibly in response to some pressure on Plato to justify the kind of dialectical method that you see in the earlier dialogues, the Socratic method, as more than just a skeptical game that failed to yield any answers. So it would be quite frustrating to just have Socrates ask people a bunch of questions and repeatedly show them that their answers are unsatisfactory, which is what happens throughout the early dialogues. Remember, I said that more negative work is done in them than positive work, so perhaps Plato wants to show that the early dialogues aren't just for nothing, and we are making some progress in clearing that intellectual ground to make room for the just appreciation of virtue, and Socrates isn't just here to tell people they are wrong all the time. So, in other words, Plato seems concerned to some extent with justifying the Socratic method. He wants to convince us that it is fruitful, because, imagine how a conversation between you and Socrates might go down. After some time, you perhaps inclined to get frustrated and think the conversation isn't getting anywhere, and turn around and say, well, Socrates, what do you think? What is your answer? Just killed a mosquito. So the middle dialogues, in other words, are more concerned with positive work. And they aren't really in dialogue form, even though we call them dialogues, and they don't exhibit the Socratic method so much. And that makes sense, really, although it may seem strange at first. Okay, so after all, Plato, if Plato favors the Socratic method, why would he refrain from using it in the middle dialogues? Well, given that he wants to justify the Socratic method, to employ it towards its own, to employ the Socratic method towards its own justification, wouldn't make any sense, because that would be circular reasoning or begging the question, which is a logical fallacy. Okay, so the merits of the Socratic method are precisely what is at issue here, so we can't use it to establish its merit. We can't use the Socratic method to establish the merit of the Socratic method. Okay, so if you are skeptical about the utility of the Socratic method, then Plato wouldn't be alleviating any of your skepticism by using it. That would just compound your skepticism. Okay, but there's also another reason why Plato avoids the Socratic method in the middle dialogues, and the two reasons are not mutually exclusive. Okay, they can positively cohere. So Plato believed that young people should not be exposed to the kind of seemingly drastic methods like the Socratic method of the early dialogues. And at the Academy, which is Plato's school, there is a rule which prohibits students younger than 30 years of age from taking part in such exercises. And at first glance, this might also seem strange, because Plato obviously thinks the method to be valuable. Indeed, he's going to all of this effort in the middle dialogues to justify its use. So why wouldn't he want young students to be exposed to it if it's so useful as he thinks? Well, let's draw an analogy from contemporary university education. Okay, so suppose you are a mathematics student in your first year of university. During this time, the mathematics you will be exposed to are like finished and completed products. So you just get the final picture, so to speak, but miss out on all of the trial and error and controversy that led up to this mathematics being accepted by mathematicians. So indeed, mathematics has this stereotype as being a rather black and white discipline without gray areas and vague concepts. There's always a right answer, and actually this just isn't quite the case. This is just true of the kind of mathematics you see throughout high school and at the early university level. But actually, the foundations of mathematics are still being debated, and I alluded to that a bit earlier when I mentioned Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead's book, Principia Mathematica. Okay, and arguments, debates occur between prominent mathematicians. Now, it would probably not be beneficial to expose first-year mathematics students to those high-level disputes. Like axiomatic set theories, such as the Zermelo-Fraenkel axioms plus the axiom of choice, things like Gödel's incompleteness theorems, the Banach-Tarski paradox, and so on. This is just likely to confuse them more than anything, and the students are unlikely to have the tools, the mathematical understanding to follow what's going on. They probably won't recognize much of the notation or understand the language in which these debates take place. So it just wouldn't be helpful to them. Okay, it's likely to intimidate the student and make them feel like they don't have much aptitude for mathematics, and the university may lose a mathematics student. So this is an imperfect analogy, but I suspect it's something of this sort that motivates Plato to have a rule like this. I mean, just imagine being a young, aspiring philosopher, having recently just joined Plato's Academy, without much experience in the discipline, and being made to take part in this back and forth seemingly adversarial debate with someone who was among the most prominent and profoundly thinking philosophers in the Western world during that time, and worse yet, in front of a small audience. Okay, you'd probably come away embarrassed, maybe feeling a little silly, discouraged towards your goal of becoming a philosopher, and so on. This is bad for you and bad for Plato's Academy, and just not the goal of the Socratic method. Okay, this is the Socratic method gone wrong. Okay, so it's in these dialogues that Plato defends what came to be known as Platonism. So Platonism with a capital P, it's often written with a capital P to emphasize the fact that it's directly Plato's views, as opposed to sometimes when it's written with a lowercase p, and that means like more modern contemporary views, but indirectly inspired by Plato. But anyways, we don't have to worry about that distinction here because I'm only going to talk about the capital P kind of Platonism because this video series is on Plato. Okay, so Platonism just refers to any views that owe their classical origin to the ideas of Plato, and at the moment this definition is not all that helpful and a bit circular because essentially, given what I've said about the definition of Platonism, then saying that Plato was defending Platonism in the middle dialogues just amounts to saying that Plato was defending his views. Okay, so of course he is. I haven't really told you much. But we will become familiar with what those views are later in the series, so we will rectify this. Okay, so the positive doctrines, i.e. Platonism, in this period are pretty uncompromising, so they don't really give much ground to criticism. And a pivotal concept in these middle dialogues is forms, and they are supposed to be independent, real, perhaps divine, indivisible, and changeless entities which share features of the things of which they are the form. So this is probably a little obscure, but we will do examples in later videos. In fact, I might do some in this video. Okay, but the forms also cause these things as well. So something that's important to understand is that they are not just common properties or universals, which is another term for common properties in philosophy. Right, so what's a universal? A universal is like a property or relation that can be instanced or instantiated, so to speak, by a number of different particular things, right? So for example, each yellow thing provides an instance of the property yellowness, or we might say that they instantiate yellow, or yellow is instantiated by them, right? So a yellow car instantiates the property of yellow. Similarly, a square table is an instance of the property of squareness. So these objects are partaking in these universals. In these cases, the car partakes of the universal yellowness, and the table partakes of the universal squareness. Okay, so these things are covered by these universals, or the things covered by universals are similar in some respect, right? So everything that is yellow has something in common. Okay, yellow cars and yellow coins have something in common, namely they have a color in common, regardless of how different their other features may be. So just think about how different the other features of cars and coins are, right? The other features are quite different, but they share this property in common. So this property is a universal. Some of the philosophical questions that are raised about universals include questions like, are they discovered or invented? How are we to think of something that has itself no spatial position, yet is instanced or instantiated at many places and at many times? So, for example, the idea of yellow just on its own seems rather unintuitive without there being some object to be yellow, right? Just try to imagine yellow without any yellow object, okay? So what is this relation of instantiation? Can sharing the same property be analyzed in terms of resemblance? Does the mind perceive this general property, the universal on its own, in addition to the particular instance of it? So does the mind perceive yellow itself, in addition to objects that are yellow? And guess what? An early approach to answering these questions, or an early attempt to answer these questions, is Platonism. Okay, so perhaps we are ready to do a little bit of rectification to that circular definition I gave you earlier for Platonism. We could perhaps even break it down to one sentence. It's an oversimplification, but nonetheless not an inaccurate definition of Platonism. And that would be that Platonism is the view that universals exist independently of things. Okay, so yes, yellow does exist just on its own, independently of yellow objects, and yes, so does the square, according to Plato or according to Platonism, right? And these are examples of forms. Okay, yeah, so we are going to do some examples in this video. Okay, so Plato thinks that the world in which we live isn't the real world. He thinks the real world is really behind, so to speak, the physical world which we inhabit. Okay, so the world behind our world is the realm of forms, whereas our world is the world of mere appearances. And basically, the things in the world of appearances, so that's our world, the one that we are used to experiencing, the things in our world are always striving to imitate their corresponding forms in the other realm, the realm of the forms, right? Okay, so imagine again our square table from the previous example. Okay, well, the table isn't going to be perfectly square. Okay, it will be a crude approximation of a square, however accurate it may be. It's not going to be perfect. But what makes it a square table is the fact that it imitates an actual perfect square, right? Or the actual perfect square. So, you know, a perfect square with 90-degree internal angles and perfectly straight pairs of parallel lines of uniform length and so on, okay? But, you know, notice that if this perfect square didn't exist in some sense, then it wouldn't make sense to compare the square table to the concept of squareness, okay? Because you're comparing it to something that doesn't exist. You know, you're comparing it to something that doesn't exist according to Plato. So this table is trying to imitate the form of square, and the form of square exists in the realm of the forms behind our world, which is the world of appearances, or the realm of appearances, okay? So similarly, the table has other properties which are trying to imitate their corresponding form. Even the table itself is striving to imitate the form of table, okay? But nothing in the world of appearances can ever perfectly imitate their form, because if they did, they would no longer be imitations. They would be actual forms. They would be the forms themselves, and we are not living in the realm of the forms, okay? They aren't in here amongst us. They're in the transcendental realm, you know, the realm of forms. Okay, so apprehension of the forms, in other words, getting an intellectual handle on them or a grasp of them, counts as knowledge to Plato, okay? Whereas beliefs about the changing everyday world of appearances is just mere opinion, okay? So Plato has a much more detailed theory of knowledge, which we will explore later in the video series, but it's worth saying at the outset that whilst Plato's ideas would seem rather bizarre and radical to the modern reader, and indeed, few contemporary philosophers would describe themselves as thoroughgoing Platonists with a capital P. His theory of knowledge is an exception and still widely accepted today. Not the part about the knowledge of the forms, though, okay? So nothing that I say about knowledge in Plato's philosophy is going to be the part that's still widely accepted today. That's for later. Okay, so moving on, in Plato's philosophy, knowledge is like the recollection, or the recollection of the acquaintance we had with the forms in a previous time. You see, Plato thinks that we have souls and adopts the doctrine of the immortality of the souls. Okay, so don't be too creeped out by the word soul here, okay, because in later philosophy it sort of comes to be synonymous with the word mind. Okay, but anyways, Plato thinks that minds, or souls, are immortal, so maybe be creeped out by that word, immortal. And this previous time where our souls were acquainted with the forms is before our soul became imprisoned in our body. So this thinking kind of influenced Descartes, or Descartes' mind-body dualism, and I'll probably make a video series on René Descartes too. Okay, so the birthing process is the process by which our soul becomes trapped in the body, and apparently, according to Plato, this wreaks havoc on our memory, right? So you can't really remember what your soul got up to before it came to be in your body, but Plato thinks that before you were born, your soul couldn't have dwelled in the physical realm because souls are supposed to be immaterial, okay? So it must have come from another world, and the only other one is the realm of the forms, or the world of the forms, and being immaterial, in order to exist in the physical realm, your soul needed to have a physical vehicle to get around in, right? So that's your body in Plato's philosophy. Okay, so your soul hung out with the forms before you were born, and you can faintly remember some of the knowledge it acquired from the forms, even though the birthing process has made you forget a lot of stuff, right? So this is why we only have an imperfect grasp of a square, for instance, and other concepts like justice and courage, okay? So for example, you've probably heard the saying that there's a fine line between courage and stupidity, you know, and it's hard to know where to draw that line or something like that, right? Well, Plato thinks that this is because of our imperfect knowledge of the form. So in this case, our imperfect knowledge of the form of courage and our hazy memory of it. Okay, so knowledge for Plato is not learning new facts. Okay, so it's not being completely ignorant and then all of a sudden learning a fact which you didn't know before. It's a process of recollection because the soul already has it, right, from its prior hanging out in the realm of the forms. Okay, right. So, and this picture is one of, you know, all of these souls lining up in the world of the forms. So I'm painting a bit of a caricature of it here, but you know, perhaps they're all on the form conveyor belt, and they get to the end of it, upon which they're dropped into bodies which are waiting in the physical realm as mothers are giving birth to their babies, right? Okay, moving on. The Republic, you will recall, is Plato's most famous and important work. Okay, it's a celebrated comparison between justice and order in the soul, as well as in the state or a society. Right. So there's a famous myth about a cave, often called the allegory of the cave, which introduces the doctrine that only those who apprehend the form of the good are fit to rule. Okay, so the good is a unique and distinguished form. Okay, it's the most important one, and the goal of philosophy for Plato is to apprehend the good, to understand the good. Okay, and this goal can be achieved, you know, if at all, only after what seems like a lifetime of philosophical reflection or a philosophical pilgrimage, so to speak. Okay, and you can see now why Plato thinks that only philosophers are fit to rule, which I mentioned in the previous video. Okay, so you know, only those who can grasp the form of the good are fit to rule, and it turns out, according to Plato, that only philosophers can grasp the form of the good. So you know, so therefore, only philosophers are fit to rule. Okay, so I think this is a good place to leave it for now, because we've done a lot. And I think the next video will be the last of the overviews before we start exploring Plato in more depth and detail. So far, I haven't really been explaining why Plato holds these beliefs, but just telling you that he does. Okay, so more to come, and you know, so stay tuned for the next one. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe, and maybe share it with your friends. Bye for now.